Can everybody hear me? Is this okay? Fabulous. So I'm going to be talking about the invisible fishers. Often when we talk about gender and resource management or development, the word invisible gets brought up quite a lot. So I'll try not to use it too often. So just a quick overview. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to what it is I do and why it is I do it. And then I'm going to go into a global review that I recently had published. And then concentrate on a Philippines case study. And for the case study, I'll be concentrating on the quantitative data. I do have more, but for today, we'll be looking at the quantitative results and finally look at some conclusions. So first of all, what is gender in fisheries? I can tell you what it is not. I am not studying the gender of fish. Whenever I try and find new papers that come out about gender in fisheries, I always get a slew of papers talking about the gender of fish. Fish don't have gender. They have sex, not gender. Does anybody need that explained? Gender is a social construct, so it has to do with our culture. Humans have culture. Fish might have culture too, but it's harder for us to determine that. So usually what they're talking about is male fish and female fish, which is actually biological sex, not gender. So instead, I'm actually looking at how men and women fish. And this might be surprising because, of course, women don't fish. Well, you can study how men fish, and that's fine. There's lots of interesting gender interactions that go within men's fisheries. But I wanted to include women's fisheries. But, of course, if you start with women don't fish, what can you do from there? Also, people often essentialize this fact that women don't fish, so women cannot fish because they are physically unable to, because of certain physical limitations. This has actually evolved. We actually think that, yes, women do fish sometimes, but instead of focusing on fishing, there's been increasing focus on the pre- and post-harvest activities that women predominantly participate in, so marketing, processing of fish. These are all really wonderful things to study, very important, but I still want to study women's fishing within the larger context of women and men's fishing. So that's where the gender comes in. So when somebody tells me women don't fish, I always get a little weird because, of course, I've seen women fish. So here's a picture of a woman fishing. And, of course, I've read things about women fishing. So the first major review was done by Chapman in 1987. It was a review of anthropological data from around Oceania. Now, a lot of it was from the early 1900s, but she did quite a thorough job. And she came to the conclusion that women fish, they just fish differently than men do. So to describe this sort of more in a cartoonish way, oftentimes when we think of fishing, we think of people in boats using various types of gear or even going underwater. And this is, according to Chapman, all the things that men would participate in. Women would do something a bit different, which is called gleaning. So it's walking along in intertidal habitats and catching primarily macroinvertebrates. So we're talking shells, so bivalves, and gastropods like snails, and oftentimes sea cucumbers, urchins, and other types of echinoderms. So already you can see that there might be an ecological difference between the types of fishing that men do and the types of fishing that women do, assuming, of course, that this divide is absolute and complete. However, she did do this review in 1987. It's been a while since then, and it was only in Oceania, so she might just be talking specifically to one place and one time. So I decided to do a global review of more current literature. So I looked for case studies in the last 20 years that actually mentioned women fishing at all. And I found about 103 case studies from around the world. As you can see, it's a bit patchy. There's quite a concentration of examples from the Pacific as well as Southeast Asia. This is largely because most of the current work being done on gender in fisheries is from those regions. But this just shows us where women fish. It doesn't tell us anything about how much they're fishing, why they're fishing, whether they're having fun. So I also did I coded all these papers looking for very specific things, descriptions for ecological specifics. So whether they described methods used, species caught, and habitats fished in. So a lot of the papers describe the methods used, often describing the differences between the men and women's fisheries. Much less frequently did they talk about issues of fishing pressure, especially quantitative issues. So in terms of counting the number of fishers involved, quantifying the catch size, the fishing effort, or the catch per unit effort, very rarely done. So we know women fish, we just don't really care enough about it to count it. And also economic, the use of catch was also done fairly infrequently. And when I say it was mentioned, the paper might have said, oh yeah, we saw one woman doing something over there once. I would include that. So this isn't necessarily a very thorough, it's a wide range of descriptions of women fishing. And what you get from this, the larger picture, is a wider ecological context. So we find that although Chapman is generally, her difference between men and women's fishing generally is true, it's still very diverse and very dynamic. So fishing in Oceania is different than fishing in inland Botswana, naturally. And also, fishing changes over time. So, for example, in Tahiti, women used to do gleaning until all the invertebrate species were no longer available, and now they do boat fishing. So gender and fishing rules change over time. It also tends to highlight the interaction between fisheries. So, for example, in Mexico, women's fishing is entirely for bait that the men use in their fisheries. So all of a sudden, you've got a much larger range of habitats being used for a single fishery. And it also allows us to scale up to ecosystem and community level. So we're not just by nature of somebody's gender leaving them out a larger assessment. But of course, there is a larger social context that we need to take into account. Women and men fish differently, but it's not necessarily because they have different bits. It's probably because they live within a gendered social context that we all live in. So, for example, women's fishing in the gleaning areas is often talked about in terms of it being close to home, which allows women to also do all the other things that they're supposed to do in their lives. So taking care of children, taking care of elderly, cooking food, et cetera, et cetera. But also, so this is also related to the type of social rewards that men and women get. So, for example, in northern Australia, women tend to glean because gleaning is a much shorter thing. You get a smaller catch, but it's always there, versus offshore fishing, where you can get a huge catch, but oftentimes you'll get no catch. So men's social reward comes from getting the big catch they can share with everybody, whereas women's social reward comes from being able to provide food for their family every night. So there's different social rewards that are related to gender. And finally, there's also economic concerns. So women may participate in different types of fishing related to family and livelihood strategies. So women may go off on a boat with the rest of their family if they need to consolidate catch within the family or consolidate the profit within the family. So now I'm going to move on to my case study. So as I said, there aren't a lot of quantitative details out there. So I decided to go out and get some of my own. And this was done in the Dinahan Bank. So the northern, so it's in the central Visayas of the Philippines. Everybody know where the Philippines is? Yeah. Awesome. And I went to 12 different communities within Northern Bohol. And the socio-ecological context here is very high levels of biodiversity. This is within the Coral Triangle, but also very high levels of anthropogenic pressure through small-scale fishing. So lots of people fish. There's also widespread poverty, and the management system that's done is decentralized to communities for the large part, but there's also a movement to try and make management ecosystem-based, so recognizing the great diversity of fishing that occurs, so not just doing fishing method by fishing method. I should say part of the anthropogenic pressure has to do with the fact that oftentimes illegal fishing methods are used, so dynamite fishing, cyanide fishing, other types of fishing that can also impact the habitat. So my larger question for this quantitative section was, does women's fishing, if we include it, does it make a difference? Okay, so we have anecdotes, we know that women fish, but does it actually make a difference to the characterization and quantification of the fisheries? So I measured various different things, including the number of fishers, the catch size, how far they went to fish, and the catch composition, and I also have recently included how they use their catch, so whether they eat it or sell it. So I collaborated with 4 local biologists, and they very kindly collected 600 fishing interviews for me, and they also measured fishing catch directly. So we would nab a fisher and measure their catch, and we even convinced 129 fishers to wear a GPS unit while they were fishing so we could measure how far they went. So first of all, let's talk about numbers of fishers. According to the government census, very few women fish, and about 25% of men fish in these areas. However, we decided not to believe that, and we went for a random sample, and we found that 80% of women fish and 84% of men fish. So already, a funny thing happens when you focus on women. Oftentimes you learn new things about men as well. So, of course, almost all the women were being left out, but of course, a lot of the men were being left out as well. So part of this may be the fact that they might not include gleaning, and they might not include part-time fishers when they're defining a fisher. So now we estimated the weekly tons caught by all 12 of these communities. And so as you can see, here's the bar for women. That accounts for about 25% of the total of the weekly catch. So women are fishing. Most of women's catch comes from gleaning. Men also glean, but not as much as women do. And when you look at the total, gleaning accounts for over 30% of the total catch. So a fishing method that wasn't even considered is actually 1/3 of the total. So I would think of that as important. Just briefly looking at fishers in space. So this big one right here, this big track, is a fisher going hook and line fishing. So there you can see that gray blob up there is the community. It's a tiny little island. So the fisher goes quite far away. And as you can see, the gleaner, that tiny black squiggle up there, stays quite close to home and stays within intertidal areas. So there is a difference in the habitats used and where they go spatially. So this matters. I'm not going to expand on it very much, but this matters in terms of spatial management, of which marine protected areas are a very important form of management, fisheries management in this area. And then, as well, so gleaners. When we measured the catch, we categorized the catch as either shellfish, sea cucumbers, and urchins, finfish, crabs and shrimp, squid, octopus, and cuttlefish, or a mysterious other that we weren't able to identify. So gleaners, for the most part, catch invertebrates, whereas all other fishers tend to focus on fish, except for trap fishers, who also focus on crabs. So already the different types of fishing methods are targeting different types of animals, is the take-home message there. And in terms of the use of catch, women use a greater proportion of their catch directly for eating, so 23%, versus men who use 18% of their catch for eating. So this right here, you see that green goo? That's that's something that people glean. It's the egg sac of sea hare. So oftentimes when you ask people, why do you glean? They'll say, oh, it's a bit for viand. And when they mean viand in the Philippines, what you have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is an enormous pile of rice, and then a little bit of meat on the side, or a little bit of vegetables on the side. So gleaning is often used almost exclusively for viand. So in conclusion, when we're looking at management, so if we go for traditional fishing management, if we don't include gleaning or women, which is sort of what's been done in this area in the past, usually the stakeholders that would be identified would be men. However, I believe if we actually want to do ecosystem-based management, we would have to include men and women. In terms of fishing methods that we would consider, we would have to include gleaning, and also we would have to start monitoring bivalves and gastropods as well as fish. In terms of spatial location, we would want to consider intertidal zones And in terms of catch, we would also want to think about subsistence fishing. So in conclusion, including women allows us to scale up, which is one of the main things that ecosystem-based management is supposed to allow us to do. And so it broadens our definition of fisher and fishing. It allows us to understand the greater diversity of habitats and species exploited, and allows us to look more specifically at the interactions between humans as well as animals, and examine livelihood strategies more specifically. So I just want to thank my research assistants as well as my funders and lab.
But if you see for something different, something in different area, is it possible, like A, is the stuff that the stocks that they're exploiting, are they overexploited? And B, is it necessary for them to be managed together?
Okay, so is it necessary for, I'm sorry, I'm repeating for the camera.
Yeah.
Is it necessary for men's and women's fisheries to be managed together?
Yeah, in your case.
Okay. So I assume they would be managed together because a lot of the management is done at the community scale. So so all the fishers get together, or not all the fishers, but a representative is the hope of what would happen. And so I would also suggest it'd be important to manage together at the livelihood level, so at the family level. So oftentimes men will go off to fish in a boat, and women will go gleaning, but it's all part of a livelihood strategy that fits together. So managing one is important to the other.
But in terms of management, if there's no impact, or like if management is focused on offshore fisheries,
Right.
and even women fisher fishing corporate, so that's entirely different. And maybe each work but then you create a structure where one management works with that.
Right. So the other thing is most of the gleaners we talked to had said that there's been a decline in their catch per unit effort. So that suggests that management must be done. The other thing is marine protected areas, the most common form of management in this area often includes gleaning areas. It's not just offshore. And so it would be important to include the fishers that it impacts, for sure. Yeah. That's an excellent question. So I work closely with my friend and colleague Jennifer Selgrath, and she used a different method. She used maps. She would have fishers, with the help of a research assistant, draw maps of their fishing areas, and she could get very beautiful long-term data on and looks at shifting, shifting from one fishing area to another. I wanted much more specific data on how far they were going. And you can get that from maps, but it would have taken longer actually for me to do that. So the ethical considerations, I did get a clearance to do it. So we just had to ask them if they volunteered. We explained what it was going to do. Some people did get confused. Some people did think that they were being photographed from the sky, like we would actually have a picture of them. So one of the things, one of the barriers that I found that Jenny overcame was a lot of people aren't familiar with top-down maps. So they don't live in that, they don't visualize that very well. And so part of her methods is she'd have to spend a lot of time showing them where different things were so they'd be able to visualize that in their heads. And I wanted to focus the interviews on other things, so we decided to try this method out instead.
Very, very interesting work. All focus at once. All the question was asked before. Did you focus here on the quantitative side of your analysis? Did you look at the gender power dynamics within the management structures and
haven't looked at it yet. I've got the data, but I haven't looked at it yet. So I'm very excited to do that. Other people that have looked at that include Maravik Barajo, who's preceded me as a PhD student with Project Seahorse. So she did notice that there were differences between men and women and how they participated in these meetings. So I think one of the things that might be interesting to look at is women-only spaces versus and men-only spaces versus shared spaces. That would definitely be an interesting thing about it. Yep. I answered all your questions.
Okay. Well, Danika's not going anywhere. You can find her on the second floor anymore. We'll say thank you, Danika, for really excellent and Sarah Hartwell.
You're a tough act to follow.
So, it's something that program and we can discuss it. Yeah, if anybody has ideas or thoughts and you want us to like to hear more about it.
Is that fine?
Okay, so we're now going to move from gender fisheries and subsidies. And in fact, I'm not very close to connect. I'm not sure how many people go there, but it seems pretty obvious that women are subsidizing the goods that cheap a lot. So this
Oh.
might be true of everything. Absolutely obvious.
Do you guys know how to project this on a Mac? I am not a Mac user. What's it? You? Sweet. Right on. I'm stuck in the world of PCs. There you go. Move the hand. Right. Huh? No. It took me long enough to learn how to use a computer as it is. All right, guys. Good afternoon. That was an amazing talk. It's going to be hard to follow. And the irony is lost on me that after all that really cool talk on gender issues, I'm like, we're talking about subsidies and top-down management and tax evasion and stuff. So this work is not really my, well, I guess it is my PhD work in some ways, but it's just kind of an idea that we tossed around a little bit. So we just had to write a paper on it, and I was like, oh, what better way to test it out? We can do this now. So essentially, we were thinking about when fishery subsidies are egregiously bad. And I'll explain all kind of the background of that sort of stuff. But more importantly, what could be done about it? Because I think it's pretty common, I'm sure it's not exclusive to fisheries, that you read through all these papers and you hear about again and again and again how things are bad. And I was like, all right, does anybody have any solutions here? And so that was kind of where we were coming from with this. So I know a lot of you guys don't study fisheries, so I'll just kind of put them in a global context a bit so you get a sense of what we do in the third floor. Then talk about fisheries subsidies and overfishing. And sort of the second part of the issue, which is when you don't even know what's being caught, but you're still subsidizing. And then use Mexico as a case study because it's a cool country. Everyone likes it. And we had data for it. So I thought it'd be good to use it. And finally, I want to go deeper into the strategies for reform. So just kind of by the numbers, rough estimate, and I'm going to give a shout out to the Fisheries Economics Research Unit that I work with because a lot of these numbers came from here. So every year, about 80 million tons of fish, so of anything in the ocean, are caught by marine capture fisheries. So that doesn't include aquaculture, doesn't include the inland fisheries. It's just in the ocean. That supports about 260 million jobs around the world. That's both full-time and part-time. And generating $80 billion in landed value, so how much the fisherman or woman gets paid at the beach for their catch. And then that kind of ripples throughout the economy and creates over $240 billion in economic impacts. This is all around the world. Now, it sounds like a lot, and it is. Oops. Don't use a laser. But fishery subsidies have been estimated at $30 billion. Right? So you can only see like a big chunk of that $80 billion in landed value is actually coming from subsidies. Now I'm going to make a brief disclaimer, and that was an awesome talk that Danika gave. Just get a sense of fisheries are not this one entity. There's tons of different types of gears and people and places where we're fishing. And so I'm going to generalize a little bit out of necessity, but I want to make it really clear that I'm not forgetting there's a lot of different types of fisheries, and those should not be treated equally. Okay, so a lot of the stuff that I might say may be applicable to some, but not to others, right? So what's the issue with fishing subsidies? So I'm in the economics background, marine biology. But so in natural resource management, from an economic standpoint, we're usually trying to maximize something. And for a long time, that was yield, so just tonnage out of the ocean. And that was all well and good. And more recently, we kind of moved towards maximum economic yield. So if you've never seen this graph before, it's kind of our bread and butter. And so I'm not going to use a laser because it did something to the screen. So this black line is the total revenue, so how much you caught times how much you got paid for it. Okay, and this blue line is the total cost. So how much you actually have to spend to get on your boat or dive or do whatever. And usually, when you don't have strong management, people will naturally tend to fish more and more and more until they're only meeting their costs. Okay, so the revenue equals the cost. There's no incentive for anyone else to get in because if one more person gets in, then people start losing money, so somebody gets out, right? So it's kind of it's equilibrium at open access. And so that is not great in the sense that you're losing out on all this potential yield, potential economic value, but it's still sustainable. It tends not to be super bad on fisheries, except for places like the Philippines when you have a lot of fishermen and very low opportunity costs. And so generally you'd be okay with staying there, but when you start subsidizing things on top of this, you get even more effort, but more importantly, your yield and your revenue decrease even more, and you become much more unsustainable and closer to kind of that edge of collapsing a stock, which is not good for anybody. So subsidies have been broadly categorized in good, bad, and ugly. And so the good subsidies include investments in management, research, marketing, how to add value to your products once they're already out of the water. Those are all pretty good. Bad subsidies is anything that enhances fishing capacity. So once you're at that open access equilibrium, anything that makes you go beyond that is a bad subsidy. So anything like getting cheaper fuel, getting free boats, anything like that. And ugly subsidies aren't necessarily bad, but in order to be good, they have to be applied really, really carefully and with really smart strategies and management. Needless to say, they're usually bad. Okay, and the classic example are vessel buybacks, wherein you have a fishery where there's too many boats, and you say, all right, I'm just going to give $1 million per boat. Who wants out? Right, so everyone rushes, sells all their boats, goes and buys a new one, and then that's just a waste. Right, it's not good for anybody either. Okay, so that's bad enough. We're giving out a bunch of money, private industry, public resources. But the worst part is that in a lot of cases, we don't even know how much is being taken out of the ocean, right? So when I gave you that 80 million tons at the beginning, that's how much we know. That's how much is reported. But in a lot of case studies that have been done, around 50% of the total catch goes unreported, okay? And that's due to just a lot of different species are caught, especially in tropical places, right? So if a manager happens to come by, they'll see, oh, you know what, I don't even know what these are. Just don't bother with those. Count the big ones. Those are the important ones, right? And so we lose out on that. Many other places, this is close to where I'm from in Mexico. I'm still Mexican, by the way, originally and still. Where a lot of these places are so remote that nobody ever just can go and count, right? So a lot of the catch that we're taking out is just not counted officially. So basically, we're handing out money to private firms. That's public money, taxpayer money. We're not sure what's happening to it, but we're pretty sure it's bad from everything we can see. And we just keep doing it over and over again. And that's where we are now. For example, Mexico. And I want to stress that Mexico isn't particularly bad or good in this respect. It's fairly average, actually. But it's a good case study. So around $250 million in subsidies are given out, in budget is given out to fisheries and aquaculture management. And as you can see, a lot of that is subsidies, right? Just like a big, big chunk. You can tell the research is just this little tiny sliver there. And subsidy seems to be the only one that's increasing. Now, the total landed value is about 130 million. And so in one way you could say, well, you're spending 250 to get 800, right? But the point of the matter is, and when I show you that graph, you could be spending way less money and getting even more money if only you would stop fishing as hard, right? So there's nothing good about these subsidies here. And to make things even worse, there's no tax on any fishing sector. So not only are we giving all this money away, we're not recouping it in any measurable way, right? Okay, so remember all the bad subsidy category? So in Mexico, 90% of subsidies are bad. So the enhanced capacity, they're for fuel, they give away boats, and there is a little sliver of management and research there, which is good, I guess. It's always nice to have something. And in that respect, it is pretty bad. So it ranks the worst out of Latin America as far as a ratio, but not by much. So you can already see there's some pretty serious issues here. But like I said, fisheries are not all equal, right? So these three fisheries are in Mexico. And you can see for the sardine one, which is currently huge volume fishery, right? Very low value, but huge volume. They're making a killing, right? Because you get 600, 700,000 tons a year. They don't really need the subsidy, but we'll give another one extra just because it was grandfathered in. Why not, right? It's harder to change up the management. With the abalone fisheries, actually some of the best managed in the world, sort of northern Baja, and they're making a huge profit. If you can tell, this is actually a little bit distorted because they own this particular resource. It's in small communities. And so you can see the labor costs are really high, right? Because when you own it, you pay yourself a lot, right? And so they're making a very big profit. But again, why not just add a little bit of subsidy on top, you know? As opposed to the shrimp. Shrimp on paper, and if you read any government official report or whatever, is the most valuable fishery in Mexico. 40% of landed value is shrimp. But you can tell they're running at a 20% loss, and they have been doing that for 15, 20 years. So all of that profit, or a big chunk of that profit, is actually subsidy, all right? Now one would think, well, okay, we have this valuable fishery. Maybe it's spending too much on fuel, spending too much on labor. Maybe they don't want to change. Maybe we can't make them. But we have to keep it going to support all these jobs, so let's subsidize it. So surely they're thankful. Well, not so much, right? So there's huge underreporting in the shrimp fishery, and you can see this black, the black area there is what's reported. All of the other ones are what's unreported, so these are estimates that we made here. And this big gray chunk are the discards, and most of them from the shrimp fisheries, right? So not only are we subsidizing this fishery that's very, very bad on the environment, but we don't even know how bad it is, and we have to go and estimate it, right? That to me is something really, really wrong. But this is a global issue, and harmful subsidies and poor monitoring, they're not specific to fisheries, right? So that kind of led us to think, all right, so what's been done about this in other places? And we're focusing just on natural resources because other industries like factories, you know, that make shoes or clothes or whatever, they're really different. So in those you can subsidize and you'll still get your profits and everything will be fine. Natural resources, not so much. So that's what we're kind of looking for. And lo and behold, when you take an interdisciplinary view, it turns out there's a lot more stuff out there, right? And so immediately you can see there's a lot of different subsidy reforms that have been attempted throughout the world. These are only the ones that I could find that were well documented, and actually we were able to analyze them. And so you can see, I'm going to explain what these are in a minute, but different types of reform or broad categories of reform that have been tried. And within that, each one is very specific to each place where it's been attempted. Okay, so how can we possibly make this better? So there's three main ones that we kind of saw that people have done. The first is decoupling subsidies. Okay, so a decoupled subsidy means that you give it to the industry, same as before, but you don't give it to production-related things. So instead of saying, for whatever reason you wanted to give a subsidy, maybe they're poor, maybe you want to keep jobs going, whatever. Instead of saying, I'll give you $1,000 worth of fuel credits or little fuel vouchers, here's $1,000. And you do whatever you want, right? And what they found is actually people don't take that $1,000 and buy fuel. They'll take the $1,000 and buy whatever it is they wanted to buy with the proceeds from the fishing. So they'll go and they'll buy their shoes, they'll buy their food, improve their house, and invest in something else, but it doesn't feed in as much as you would think back into the fishing. Okay, so that's pretty good. And sometimes you can actually take a longer view and say, we'll give you $1,000, but it has to be for your kids' education. So you have to buy uniforms for school. In Mexico, we use uniforms, and in a lot of places. For school or supplies or whatever. And that, again, it helps their household economy, but it doesn't feed back in to the fishing. Reoriented subsidies are, pretty self-explanatory. You take money that was being bad before and you move it somewhere else. So if there was a problem with bycatch, you target bycatch and you move those subsidies around. The key with that one is working really closely with industry to find out what their needs are. So a really cool one that I found in South Africa, the industry said, we need all these subsidies because there's a lot of overfishing, a lot of illegal fishermen, and that's what's causing us to lose our profits, right, or causing our catch per unit effort to come down. So I said, all right, we'll stop giving you all these fuels and boats, but we'll make a whole new judicial arm in their system to deal with illegal fishermen. So that's what they did. It's worked pretty well, and they just cracked down on it, use that money to crack down on that instead. Condition subsidies are linked to performance, but in a positive way. So if you know about the Marine Stewardship Council, that sort of thing, that would be a condition subsidy. So you'll say, okay, I'll give you money for fuel, but only if you buy engines that use less fuel, right? Whereas before we would say, I'll buy you a new fuel engine and I'll give you some fuel. You see what I mean? So again, as you look throughout the world, you can see that we use Mexico as a case study, but there's a lot of places where people are in dire straits, everything seemed really bleak, and yet they did something, right? And so what I'd argue is that while we have these huge issues, and not specific to fishing, where we're conferring subsidies on natural resource industries that are not performing well environmentally or economically, when there's no strings attached to the subsidies, it makes things even worse, okay? But by identifying good strategies from other industries that have worked, okay, we can see what broad categories might be applied. And the really important thing to remember is that the devil is in the details. So if you don't design it well at the beginning, you can just drastically collapse everything that was there in the first place. But and it has happened in some places, like some of these, I just showed you where they've been applied, but some of them have been spectacular failures, right? And so I guess moving forward, I would hope that we can do more of these types of work where we kind of go beyond stating the problem, and here's another example, and just kind of go through some solutions. Well, here's what these people have done. What can we learn from it? And I'll end there. Thank you. Yeah.
I think that you had all these case questions.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the stated purpose of
He's a postdoc now. He outranks me.
Did you look at the stated objectives of subsidy program? Because you mentioned job creation, but
What?
there's other reasons for it.
Well, the reason why they reform their subsidies there's many different ones. One common one Actually, one common one for developed countries is that subsidies were distorting their trade, right? So for example, in the US, if you subsidize agriculture a lot, the US is part of the WTO. There are trade restrictions. And so you can't just make your industries have a lower price than everyone else. And so that kind of prompted the reform in those senses. In a lot of the developing countries, it was interesting. It seemed to be a broader recognition of the fact that the environment is important. And so you had these massive subsidies being given away to say, well, hold on, we're actually doing ourselves a lot of damage. We have to do something about it, right? So the easiest thing would be to eliminate the subsidies, right? But it's also really, really hard on communities. And so they've kind of found ways in which they can continue to support these communities, but decrease their environmental impacts. It's a bit of a different here. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, well, there's agriculture, forestry. There were some it's like natural renewable resources, right? So mainly agriculture and forestry. Some were in fisheries. Yeah. Sorry, and energy. Energy was a big one, especially in South America for some reason. I don't know why. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I haven't looked at it formally, but it's something that was on my mind as I was like reading and stuff. And I guess what I could take away is it seems to me that the most important factor in something being a success or not is whether or not they had very clear goals on what it was for. Right? And so when they said, we want to achieve this, they usually did. But when they just said, we're not happy with this, so we're going to do something about it, and then they just did something, do you see what I mean? Then it just didn't work. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think it's, I think it's kind of historical, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think in a lot of developing countries, no tax is paid on catch. I don't know about the Philippines. Probably not. So it's kind of a combination of fishing in a lot of places has been seen as kind of like an employment of last resort. It's like, oh, like you can't do anything else, so you're fishing, so the least I can do for you is not tax it. It's a little bit of that. But also in a lot of places, the FAO actually fostered growth in fishing when population was booming and we were worried about, outgrowing the world and stuff, and we needed more food. And so they basically did everything they could to have people fish more. And it was a spectacular success, except that we are kind of past that now. And so we need to stop. Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to Andres, so we've
Yeah.
got him for a while. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Andres, for a wonderful talk.